returning to the University of Pennsylvania. Um, the same year that I arrived, the fall of 1965, was the year that Del Hymes arrived at Penn. I would not have seen myself going in as being interested in linguistic anthropology because that was the one thing that Bryn Mawr really didn't do much of a job on at all. But Del was much more approachable than anyone else on the faculty. He was supposedly a replacement for Pete Hallowell, although that's an odd stretch. They were really quite different in what they were interested in and how they approached it. They did both do history of anthropology, and for that reason I found myself interested in working with Del. I didn't expect to get interested in the other stuff. But he was one of those people who'd sit and talk to students in the coffee shop half the day. And because he was new to the university, he didn't know very many people and spent a lot of time with students and continued to do that certainly through the 4 years that I was there. His career after that was a little more complicated, but there was rapidly a group of people that coalesced around the linguistic anthropology program, and I took all the courses that were offered in that area, so I had essentially the same training as the rest of them. The required course in linguistics in the Penn four-field department at that point was an introduction to descriptive linguistics, which Del taught. It was very close to being the worst course I ever took in my life. Well, first of all, Del mumbled. Now, and our TA was an SIL linguist on sabbatical who the class moved back in the room every week as we became more disenchanted. And I remember he walked in before Del did one day and said, you really should move closer to the front. Our informant mumbles, you know. Okay, so we did some basic descriptive stuff. And then we got to, we're going to do the whole thing from morphology to syntax to semantics based on Wishram Chinook, which is the language that Del had done his dissertation on. And the final exam is going to be an analysis of the first 10 lines of Boaz's Chinook texts in any grammatical model you wish to use. Again, I was so irritated by that point that I numbered every word and had a footnote explaining what I did or didn't know about it. I got an A. It was awful. So he would come in and we would ask him questions about the language. And he would mumble something, and the TA would attempt to write it on the board. And the informant would become very agitated and run over and grab the eraser and correct it. And he would then repeat it facing the blackboard, complete with the mumble. This was not a happy experience, shall we say. I took his language and culture course in my second year, which was considerably better, but he also lectured saying, you know, at least 5 times a sentence when he became uncertain as to whether he was making his point. And because he mumbled, he didn't always make his point well. I remember once I was bored because I knew the content pretty well, so I was making little check marks every time he said, you know. And the lady next to me punched me and said, you missed one. Oops. And then that was the day, I believe, that he said, I didn't think that lecture went well. It made me feel really good that you were taking notes. It couldn't have been as bad as I thought it was. Okay. Next topic. He was, however, absolutely wonderful in the sense that he didn't try to tell you you were interested in something other than what you were interested in. And he could always find a way of responding to what people wanted to think about or talk about. and had read so broadly in so many fields that he really could do that. So it was a kind of intellect that wasn't boxed in, which I really enjoyed and have always admired in many people, but he really was awfully good at that. Of those students, and then we ran a weekly seminar which met at his home, which you took for credit for the 2 semesters that you could get credit for it. And after that, you just went. I think we had to write papers the years that we did it for credit, but that really wasn't the issue. Sometimes it was people who were visiting speakers to the university who would come and talk to us, and I met some fantastic people that way, who would, in a very informal way, just kind of hang out and talk. And it usually adjourned to ping pong in the basement. Very competitive for the guys, Joel Scherzer and Del. Del couldn't beat Joel at tennis because Joel was a tad younger and in better shape, but he could sometimes beat him in ping pong, so we spent a lot of time doing that too. And then people talked about their own work, and sometimes it was things that we were reading. I've tried to do that kind of informal teaching for students in my own teaching, and I think it's a really productive kind of approach to things. Del had a large grant which produced a field guide from any age, which so was supposed to be education related, wasn't particularly, but something for the ethnographic study of speech use, making the kind of theoretical argument that he did in that period, that linguists studied the structure of language and that anthropologists studied the social organization of the society, but the way in which language was a resource that moved in between the 2 approaches was something that nobody was paying attention to. So the strategy was that we would all go read old ethnographies and extract from them the things that were about speech. And then we would be able to write questions based on the range of answers we got to or the range of data we had, which would be able to demonstrate that there's more than one way to do this. That is, that speech use is not a universal kind of thing that everyone does the same way, but that it is structured in different ways, and we can give you evidence of how that happens. We all got divided up into culture area kind of assignments, and I got Native North America, which means I've read a lot of ethnographies of Native North America. And we all came up with just incredible amounts of interesting data. And then Joel Scherzer and I largely put together the questions, which appeared as an appendix to Gompers and Himes' collected essays, explorations in ethnography of speaking, maybe something like that is the title, which means that it was supposed to turn into a book, and that just went haywire because, well, for a variety of reasons. Joe and I had both left Penn by that point, and Del was doing other things, and it just sort of never happened. I think it would have been interesting. See, here's the question, here's a range of answers to it. But it certainly gave all of us a kind of basis for saying that ethnography gives you very concrete ways of defamiliarization from any one system. I think it's really important not to have only us and them, the society I studied and the one I grew up in, and I did in my own career, at least dip into more than one kind of ethnographic context. And I think it's critical to begin to see that the issues may be, the functions of language may be universals, probably are universals, in the kind of way that Roman Jakobson talked about. And I think that's significant. But it is not that we expect the details to be similar. This was, of course, the era when Noam Chomsky was busy saying that everything was universal and that linguistic diversity was at a completely trivial level. which descended to, I think, a complete non sequitur kind of argument where it belongs in the universal grammar if it's universal. Or it is certainly a true statement that language with a capital L, that is the species resource, has properties which are held by all of the small l languages that we know, attested human languages. That's true. The question is that his model will not allow you to find out what those features are until you've compared them to some of those real languages. So we were at odds. Dell's response to Chomsky and his students was to talk about competence for performance. And that is to try and drag back in what people were doing in the real world. I don't think any of the transformational grammar types actually read it, but it was an argument that made a lot of sense on the anthropology side, I think. There were some contacts with the linguistics department. I audited one course over there with Henry Hernigswald, who was absolutely wonderful. Henry was interested in what we were doing. It was a course in historical linguistics, but called Comparative Indo-European. But he said to me when I asked if I could audit that he would be pleased to have me do that, but he didn't know much about American Indians. That's okay. I didn't expect you to. But he says, I'll talk about them when I have an example that would fit. The only one he ever came up with was Bloomfield Central Algonquin, which is, Bloomfield obviously was someone he knew as a Germanicist very well. But he taught me to think about the process of language change as something that is a balancing dimension to the synchronic view that we get of a language ethnographically. That's been very useful. That perspective also came from Bill Above, who came from Columbia to Penn while I was there. And again, Bill was trying to come up with a way of talking about the point in which something that was a variation within language that you could understand in terms of variables of class and education and other things would in fact give you a way of understanding how the language was changing, and the point at which you saw a real phonemic change across the whole language. That's a process that if you read it back into historical linguistics, you begin to maybe be able to talk about the cultural and social processes that underlie language change and the meeting of peoples in a way that at least some historical linguists, and certainly the synchronic TG types, just weren't prepared to talk about in linguistics in that period. So there were a lot of ways in which things were coming together interestingly. Bill Above's teaching was largely to anthropology students, not to linguists. I don't think they saw him as a real linguist at all, because he had tape recorder in hand and was constantly interviewing people about the way they spoke. And I did learn a lot about sticking microphones under people. I haven't done much of that, but the tenacity with which you attempt to figure out what's going on out there in the world is something that I have always and continue to admire in Bill's work. He was thoroughly he was also a collaborative anthropologist in a way that makes, linguist in his sense, in that he always had field assistants from the black community in New York and later in Philadelphia who were working with him on this stuff. And that was very good. The other person that came into this network of people that were forming a subgroup within the anthropology department to a large extent was Irving Goffman. And I had a contentious relationship with Irv in many ways that I think we both enjoyed. When I heard of his death in 1982, my initial thought was not how awful for the profession, but you can't do this to me. I haven't finished that argument with you yet. And I suppose I'm still having it in some ways. He took the position largely, I think, to challenge us, that we ethnographers going out and doing our field work on the use of language, would never be able to say things as sophisticated about those societies that we had dipped into briefly as he would be able to say about his own society. Now, I think that's a really narrow-minded view of his own work, since he studied compulsive gamblers, mental patients, homosexuals, various other Shetland Island Scots. He was none of those things, I am quite certain, and yet managed to be remarkably perceptive about what was going on. He was an irritating person to know because he was always observing your behavior and telling you what you were doing. It's as though he's going, yeah, there's this no naming thing. Most of you can't decide whether to call me Irving or Dr. Goffman, and so you don't call me anything. Well, yes, that's true. I learned from that to tell my students what my position is on that very early on. And it is, if you know me, please use my first name. Dr. Darnell is someone for formal circumstances. I don't actually know that person very well, but that's all right, too. And Irving also, I also disputed with him the question of the distinction between private and public behavior. When he first arrived at Penn, Dell had a party for the crew, and it was you have to come stuff, obviously. Nobody could cut those. So Dell and Irving and a couple of other people were standing around talking, and I wandered up to the group, sort of, what's going on in this conversation? And Dell, who was something of a klutz in a physical sense as well as mumbling, grabbed my drink, had a slug out of it, and handed it back to me. And I didn't blink. As his research assistant for 3 of the 4 years I was at Penn, I was pretty used to him doing things like that. Okay. The entire group cracks up. Apparently Irving has announced that it is a rule of our society that you can't take someone's drink and do that. And a few minutes after that, George Stocking, who was on leave at Penn that semester, conveniently for me, because it was the semester I finished my History of Anthropology MA and defended the proposal for my PhD, and it was a very good time to have George around and to talk to, and I got to know him quite well because the only place they could find to put him was an alcove outside Dell's office, and so I spent a lot of time talking to him when Dell wasn't around. So George wanders up to the group, and I dragged him to all the student parties because he didn't know anybody, and Dell was too busy to pay any attention to him. So George wanders up on the other side of me, and I grab his drink, have a slug out of it, mumble, I still think scotch tastes like dishwater, and hand it back to him. Okay. Group cracks up again. They do not get this. Now, it's actually quite straightforward. We all knew each other very, very well. I think it probably did require the gender difference. I don't think a guy could have gotten away with that. But I knew both of those guys quite well, and at a level where they weren't going to make an issue out of something so fundamentally silly. Irving, however, was really flustered, and it was one of the few times I saw him flustered, that what is straightforwardly something that if you know the parties engaged, you could expect would not be a big deal. Public behavior, of course, you don't walk up to a stranger and do that. But I think that Irving always thought that private behavior was not subject to explanation. It is. It just requires a kind of narrative and a sense of the social structure. I think he was wrong about that. He also lectured us all about how we should not think of speech as a category. The category was interaction and speech a resource toward it, and I think he was right about that. And I think we were all much better anthropologists for having him nattering at us for a long time on that front, which he did. The people that were part of that group, perhaps, many of them have gone on to do really interesting things. Judy Irvin Eleanor, then Keenan, now later Oakes, Susan Phillips, Joel Scherzer, who was in linguistics technically, but in our part of the world most of the time. Sheila then Seitel, but now Dower, who had her career not in academia, but working for dead blank. The people that write letters on behalf of people who are imprisoned on Amnesty International, that's what I want. Sorry, it just wasn't there for a moment. And has had a really fine activist intellectual career with Amnesty International. Michael Foster, who came to the National Museum of Canada and worked with Iroquois materials work that he began at Penn with Dell and also with Tony Wallace. Tony was the other intellectual influence on me outside this immediate network of linguistic anthropology, people who were a unit. I was the only one of that group that got to know Tony very well. Michael Foster tried, but they just didn't seem to hit it off at a point where they could talk easily. So Michael largely worked on his own and did, I think, some really important work. Tony had the other half of the office that was the balcony of the old University Museum auditorium, which was downstairs was the department office, and upstairs Tony Wallace, who was the chair, had half of it, and Dell had the other half, and then outside it, desks for whoever happened to be around. Secretary in Tony's case, and in mine, I effectively had my own office for 3 of the 4 years I was there. So I got to know Tony quite well because I was around when he was drinking coffee and whatever. And when I got interested in Iroquois treaty speech, which is something that Mike Foster later did much more seriously and really fascinating work, Tony took me out to his other office at Eastern Pennsylvania Psychiatric Institute and let me use his own field notes and files, which is something that he was an incredibly generous man who, again, was not a good classroom teacher, but who was an absolutely fantastic mentor. He never did small talk very well at all. So you didn't start a conversation with, so, how's the weather? How you doing? How you been? No, not at all. You came in and said, I've been thinking about this. Do you know anything about blah, blah? And you couldn't shut him up if it was something that he knew something about and was able to talk to you about. He wasn't shy. He was introverted, and someone that I came to treasure as a friend. His death in the last couple of years has been a real loss for me because he was important to me in many ways. And I would have counted him as a friend by the time I left Penn, which wasn't true of most of them, most of the faculty. Ward Goodenough, who was the other person doing componential analysis, kinship, ethnoscience kinds of work at Penn, I really did not relate. I came to know him better long after, but as a student, I did not find myself close to him at all. And he really didn't have much contact with the group of people that I largely spent my time with. David Sapir was there in that period. I audited his course in French structural anthropology. It wasn't actually what I needed to know about that. That I learned considerably later. But such as it was, I certainly knew David socially because he was part of the group around Dell. Much less so his wife then, Olga de Linares, whom I never took a course from. She was the only woman on the faculty at Penn, which was a switch for me, to put it mildly. There were people in the Annenberg School of Communication, Saul Worth particularly, who were part of the group of us that did ethnography or speaking sorts of things. and Dan Ben Amos in folklore, particularly Kenny Goldstein to a degree. Oh yes, and then George Stocking made me take a course with his friend Charlie Rosenberg in American Civilization. I met Charlie again at the American Philosophical Society sometime in the last 10 years and walked up to him and said, you probably don't remember me, but I did take a course from you once. And he looked down his nose at me and said, I don't remember all of my students, but I do remember you. I don't know what that meant. I remember it as being utterly delightful. It was me and I think 14 first-year MA students in effectively American history. And we had to read a book a week on different approaches to American history, which I found fascinating. I really enjoyed the course. I wasn't taking it for credit, but I did all the work. And so these 14 interchangeable, they all wore the same kind of clothes and polished their shoes and carried the same kind of briefcase. Wow, clones. And they would all memorize all the dates and facts in the books and come in and want to spout it all back. And I would read the books lightly and come in and talk about the perspective. So Charlie and I had a lot of really interesting conversations in class. I guess I'm not surprised he remembers me. I think it was probably positive. But I could be something of a brat in those days. Probably still can. Anyway. So Penn was a very interdisciplinary place where a lot of stuff was percolating all the time and where you could find someone to talk to about practically anything. Toward the end of the period I was there, they were all putting together what became the Center for Urban Ethnography. So Dell, Irving, John Schwed was there in folklore at that point, and Bill LeBeouf. And they really did create something, I think, very exciting, but it didn't come together till after I left Penn in 1969. Dell from there became, well, he left Penn for the folklore department, not being happy with his relationships to colleagues in anthropology. He found folklore kind of a backwater in the university. It was kind of into coffee shops and folk music, which I enjoyed because I knew some of those people. But that didn't work well for him either, though he had good friends in that department. So he then became Dean of Education at Penn. And that, plus the Center for Urban Ethnography, I think, created the politics to go around the edges of the poetics that had been part of the sort of anthropology that we had all been talking about. When Dell took a job at the University of Virginia after 2 terms as dean, he was telling me that he wasn't sure that it was ethical for him to give up the political positions. And I said, well, we do the politics for the sake of the poetics. You really can go and do that stuff now. And he seemed to think that was okay. It's a question of balancing the kinds of things that one works in, I think.